Our region is South Africa from 1948 to 1994. The human violation conflict during 1940 to 1994 is apartheid, which means apartness. So in other words, segregation between black South Africans and the 20% of the nation which were whites. Before apartheid even started, racial segregation and white supremacy had become the central aspects of South Africa. The Land Act passed in 1913 marked the beginning of territorial segregation by forcing black Africans to live in reserves so that the white Africans could live or build buildings where the black Africans lived in before. They also made it illegal so that black Africans could not work as sharecroppers. The opponents of the Land Act formed the South African National Native Congress, which later it became the AWC, the African National Congress. Racial segregation was basically apartheid. Black South Africans had to be separated from white South Africans because of the color of their skin. Some were dark and others were light-skinned. You would think that because it's part of Africa, there would only be dark-skinned people, but there wasn't because the white people started to accumulate in a country that at the time weren't.
So, separate development. Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd, who became Prime Minister of South Africa in 1948, refined apartheid policy into a system called separate development. Separate development was another name for apartheid. To Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd, the name separate development seemed better. He thought that by calling it a separate development.
In 1948, the National Party established a racial institution named the apartheid. This policy was designed to ensure that the whites would continue to dominate the country. By 1950, the government had banned marriages between whites and people of other races and prohibited sexual relations between black and white South Africans. Then the apartheid established the Population Registration Act of 1950, which classified all Africans to be categorized into three races: Bantu, or black Africans, colored, and white. Sometimes families were also categorized. Parents would be white and children would be colored. A series of land acts set aside more than 80% of the country's land for the white minority, and passed laws that required non-whites to carry documents to have authorization in restricted areas. During these land acts, the government wanted the limit of contact of white races and non-whites. The government then established separate public facilities for whites and the other races, and limited non-white labor units to participate in the national government. This would then lead to a removal of many Africans from their homes and put to another facility set for only Africans.
Prohibition of mixed marriages. In 1949, Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act and the Immorality Act in 1950 were the first step in starting and institutionalizing racial differentiation. These acts prohibited marriages between whites and interracial sexual intercourse, which would become a criminal offense. Areas Act. This act restricted blacks in urban, industrial, and agricultural areas only for the whites. The only people allowed in these areas were workers who were given state permission. If they were found in these areas without permission, they would be imprisoned. These racial groups were placed in different residential and business sections. Act. This act required that all Africans were classified into three racial groups. These racial groups were black, colored, or white. The government made these classifications by the way people looked, their education, and the way they acted. The racial groups were given rules. The Bantu Self-Government Act. The Bantu Self-Government Act of 1959 created 10 homelands known as Bantustans. This would separate black South Africans with each other so that it could seem like there was no black majority, and this would reduce the possibilities that black South Africans would unify into a nationalist organization. This would supposedly give them political rights, but were taken out of the nation's political body. From 1961 to 1994, more than 3.5 million people were removed from their homes and got put into Bantustans where position. Resistance to apartheid within South Africa took many forms. It started off as a non-violent demonstrations, protests, and strikes, and later on armed resistance because the South Africans noticed if they couldn't threaten the whites, nothing would be done. The African National Congress, also known as the ANC, was one of the groups to fight against apartheid. This group was led by Robert Mangaliso Subukwi, who worked with the South Indian National Congress, and they created a mass conference in 1952. During this protest, the Pan-African Congress, also known as the PAC, was another group fighting against apartheid, except the Pan-African Congress was all of Africa, not just South Africa, like the ANC. Sharpsville tried convincing anti-apartheid leaders they wouldn't get anywhere peacefully, so both the PAC and the ANC established military wings. By 1961, Nelson Mandela, leader of the peaceful protests and armed resistance against whites, was imprisoned for his actions from 1963 to 1990. This caused attention and helped to support ends. The protests and government defiance that followed, combined with economic recession, this brought attention to South Africa and showed what apartheid truly was. The National Party was pressured from the International Congress to start ending the laws they passed. A new constitution in which blacks and other racial groups were allowed to vote started in 1994. Elections that year led to an alliance government with mostly non-whites, causing the end of apartheid.